Awesome. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Reddit Roasts, where John and I dissect the profiles that are posted on Reddit and give our wholehearted opinion, very, very blunt and direct. John, lovely to have you again.
Great to see you, Sam. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Should we dive into the first profile?
Let's do it.
Okay, today we have a 28-year-old male gay engineer, 760 GMAT, 3.6 GPA. So a bit of context on this profile. So we have Bachelor's of Science in Petroleum Engineering, minor in finance, Big Ten State School with a 3.6 GPA. Interesting. We have 6 years of work experience in oil and gas, working in a rotational role where I lead operations on a drilling frack site. That's interesting. 20 personnel. Later grew into a project engineering role for the frack location, operating $100 million a year budget. Then moved to a business analyst role, stewarding cost tracking. Okay, extracurriculars. Board member for LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce, other volunteering work, white male, 760 GMAT with a 49 quant. MBA goal, pivot into a strategy consulting. OP is saying, John, not MBB or bust, but wants to stay in strategy, which is what he's been doing in the last sort of part of his role. Ideally in oil and gas or chemicals, preferably in the Midwest or Texas after graduation. Has loved the business aspects of the role, coming from an engineering background. MBA makes sense to build business acumen. Very, very good reasoning. Some interest in cycling, running, hiking, rock climbing. Target schools, Kellogg, Sloan, Booth, Reach schools, Target, Tuck, Ross, Darden, Safety McCombs. Worried my GPA might be a limiting factor. Question is whether I cut some slack for being slightly under the median as a STEM major. Okay, John, let's start with a profile evaluation. Just wholehearted, whole 30,000 view. How do you see this profile?
Sam, I like this profile overall. I'll cycle through the different sections holistically. Academically, pretty solid GMAT, actually very solid GMAT of 760. I love that 49 quant. The GPA is not as much of a concern as he thinks it is. A 3.6 with a STEM major at a top state school. Keep in mind that some state schools have deflation, so a 3.6 is not a concern. I would rate this academic section maybe a 4 to 4.5 out of 5, which is pretty good.
Nice.
Professionally, rotational engineering and a business analyst, yes, please. The problem with engineers is that they don't have much strategy and leadership experience. His leadership experience looks pretty strong to me. And as an analyst, you have a dose of strategy work. So I would give this a 4 out of 5 as well. I like what I'm seeing from OP. Demographics, LGBT, but also efforts to show that he's promoted inclusion in the space. The volunteer hours definitely reinforce that. So I think that's a pretty strong right out of the bat. Goals wise, it makes sense. We can talk a little bit about ways to add a little bit of nuance to based on his profile. But from what he's doing to consulting, I think it's a fairly standard path, and I don't think he has any issues getting there. So pretty solid across the board, Sam. Over to you.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying there about the work experience. This rotational role really grabs my attention. I think the breadth of experience that OP has in terms of rotating through different areas of operations, different parts of the drill, the frack location, but also the operating the budget and the strategy side. Within oil and gas, I very rarely see people with as much breadth of experience as this. You often have people who are focused on the finance side or who are focused on the engineering side. Very rarely do we see people with this breadth of experience, and I love that. And I think the schools will as well. I also, within that, I particularly like this management experience. Now, OP doesn't specifically say how much management experience is involved here, but I think OP can probably pick out some quite interesting stories of managing maybe conflicts in the work environment, maybe has had direct reports, but most likely has had indirect reports. Make a lovely leadership story in one of the essays. I like as well this point that you are making around LGBT. I think Now,
Mhm.
I don't want to draw stereotypes here, but the oil and gas environment, and particularly like drilling and fracking sites, are not known for being particularly LGBT friendly. So there might also be some really interesting LGBT stories here, challenges in the work environment, maybe homophobic colleagues, that kind of story that might make a really, really nice diversity essay, perhaps as well. Definitely an interesting, an if interesting um, background there.
Yeah.
You're saying about the goals, transitioning into strategy consulting. I was doing a little bit of research before our session, and McKinsey, for example, have their oil and gas practice. So McKinsey's oil and gas practice would love this profile with a decent
Mhm.
MBA and a breadth of experience
Mhm.
across oil and gas. I think that's really nice. I'm usually a little bit hesitant to encourage people down the strategy consulting role route because so
Mhm.
many people are putting that as their goals. But I really do think that fits OP. I think that's a really, really um, nice fit. John, what do you think about these schools?
I think that's a pretty reasonable array of schools, and it makes sense to apply to McCombs just because of the location, the proximity to his chosen career path.
Yeah,
I think those target schools are great. Look, honestly, um, building on what you mentioned earlier, Sam, about the sense of inclusion, about being LGBT in a traditionally in a fracking space, there's an essay within Tuck that asks, candidates about how they're individuals in their own ways, and Darden has an essay about inclusion, and so this would be tailor made for him, right? It's also not just talking about the issues, the challenges that he's encountered in the industry, but what he's done to upend that misconception.
love that.
I think this is going to be. I think this profile is a shoo-in for Tuck and Darden. And of course, I think with those great with his great academic profile, I think he has a decent shot at all of those three schools that he's listed in his reach bucket. So
Is he holding back? Should he be aiming higher?
yeah, I would love to dig into the management and impact experience that he's had at his workplace. But if you were to throw a Hail Mary application to the big three or even Harvard and Stanford, I don't think it's completely out of line there.
I think that's fair. That's sort of what jumped
Yeah,
to mind for me as well. When I was
yeah,
saying that piece around the leadership experience, that would might make a really nice leadership story
mhm,
for Harvard SAB.
yeah,
Um, I think look, and actually building on that, if the LGBTQ in the oil and gas industry has legs, if there's a really good story there, I'm imagining that for
mhm,
example, a Stanford, what matters most
yeah,
as well.
yeah,
That's
hmm
exactly the kind of story they're looking for, right?
hmm
Driving
yeah,
cultural change and building
yeah,
relationships and trust, change people's
hmm
perspectives. That would be a
yeah,
fantastic story for Stanford as well. So, no guarantees, but I think we're agreed that a Hail Mary at Harvard and Stanford is definitely worth
hmm
doing.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I love it.
A really, really good idea. Okay, let's specifically answer the questions then, just to wrap up. Concerned about the GPA. I think we're agreed that a 3.6 GPA, which is bang on the average of the M7 programs, is not stellar, but it's not going to hold him back.
Hmm Yeah.
And then the
Um,
question, go on.
no, I would say that GPA wouldn't significantly help him, but it certainly wouldn't hurt him in any way. And that 760 definitely helps make that 3.6 look a little better.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the question around, will I get cut some slack for being slightly under the median as a STEM major? Let's focus on the STEM major point. Do you
Mhm.
think that schools look at a 3.6 in a humanities subject versus a 3.6 STEM? How are they making that comparison?
I think there might be a factor. I don't think it's as big of an issue as OP points it out to be. A
Mhm.
3.6 is a 3.6, especially if you scored well in a handful of classes that are quant related.
Yeah.
Yes, there are, I would say the engineering folks applying to top schools maybe tend to have slightly higher GPAs. But I don't think this is like a situation where he has a 3.4 or a 3.3 in that space. So I don't think it's going to be an issue, even if that
Yeah.
average is slightly lower.
Yeah. No, I'm aligned. I don't see it. I don't see it as an issue. I think when you're in line with the M7s, when the GPA is in line with the M7 average, you got to give it a go, right? Yeah. Then if it's something about the profile that doesn't work, doesn't sit well with the school, don't think it's going to be academic related.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. All right, let's move on to the next profile. So, profile number 2 is one that I was flagged by a former client. They are lurking on Reddit and pointed out this profile and got in touch and said, "Hey, can you roast this one?" And I absolutely would love to. So, let me read through the profile first. So, basically, is my profile competitive enough for top schools? International applicant from Vietnam, targeting investment banking. It's quite a long post, so I'm going to try and skim it. Um, Basically, not sure about timing of application, 2025 or 2026. Fine. 26-year-old Vietnamese male bisexual. 3 years total work experience as a corporate banker, working at a blue chip non government commercial bank in Vietnam. Has a book of clients, all of the stuff that you would expect of commercial bankers, and tells a bit about the story of how he has progressed through the company, having started as an intern. That's quite a common story. Nothing wrong there. GRE hasn't been taken yet, John, but is
Mhm.
scoring 330 on example tests. So we have a bit of a benchmark. Academic background. There's a story here. I'm not going to read it in depth, but basically was admitted into a Canadian university with some scholarship money, had to drop out due to family health issues, mental health issues as a result, mustered up the courage to enroll at a local university in Vietnam, where schooling continued, majored in finance and chose commercial banking due to its relatively strong ROI and finance, stability within finance. Finally finished graduation after his internships. GPA is 3.74, although that might be a converted number. Extracurriculars, president of my class major. Interesting. Bit of violin, gym. I want to talk about the gym afterwards. Industry focus, right? This is where things get serious. So I want to pivot from commercial banking to investment banking. Commercial banking to investment banking. Have had an interest in biotechnology. So it looks like an interesting career narrative for OP is pivoting into biotech venture capital, biotech investment banking. Good. One of the examples he gives is JP Morgan, which has a strong biotech group. Okay, after some research, here's a list of schools. It looks, John, like schools that are relatively. We're talking T15, M7. He's got
Mhm.
Harvard in there as well. Seems
Mhm.
to be a bit of a focus on the on Yale and generally East Coast, although we have some Booth in there as well. And then the concerns, right? So scholarship, is it a risk for internationals to attend if the school's not T15? So we can talk generally about the rankings. Um, Introverted, is being introverted a problem during an MBA? And a little bit of a question around visas, etc. Okay,
Mhm.
John, I know there's a lot in there, and I'm sorry to dump so much on your plate. Can you give me a quick and dirty overview of how you're seeing this profile?
Yeah, overall, I do like this profile as well. Although it's a little bit different from the usual crop, and for that reason, I do like it. Academically, valedictorian with a scholarship despite the adversity. I'm sorry to hear what OP had gone through.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty strong. Look, I think most GPAs in Vietnam universities are out of a 10-point scale, so this is most certainly converted.
Uh-huh.
Without a GRE in the range, I mean, it looks like OP is scoring, in the 330 range, even if you expect that to drop 2 to 3 points below, how you've been doing the practice test, that's
Mm-hmm.
still pretty strong. With an upper 320s and a valedictorian honor, I would give this a 4.5 out of 5. Professionally, commercial banking is always tricky. I mean, Sam, I'm sure you'll have more to opine on here, but
Uh-huh.
if you come from a banking background, you might be lumped in with the other folks who come from investment banking. And so, with that said, look, OP has a ton of looks like OP has a ton of experience creating impact at the institutional level,
Mhm.
especially in an emerging economy. In a place like Vietnam can be pretty impressive. So I think if those pieces come together and if impact were to be shown, I would give this about a 4 out of 5. Pretty strong professionally, despite being in commercial banking.
Mhm.
Demographically, URM from Vietnam, less represented. We can talk about the introversion a little bit more, but look, I mean, you'd be surprised. There are a ton of people who attend business school who fall on the I scale, myself included. And so I don't think that should be a concern, especially if you're able to, again, we can talk about later, but demographically, pretty unique. No red flags there. Lastly, with goals, the goals make sense. I'm a little bit concerned about the biotech space. Looks like there's an opportunity to tap this space. I'm not seeing much of a mention of biotech in personal and professional tie. So I would love to hear a little bit more about why that is the case and whether we can make that a little bit
Mm.
make these dots connect. So as it stands today, a 3 out of 5 for goals.
Majored in biophysics, I think, is the only experience. So it doesn't sound like any work experience in that space at
Mhm.
all, but has
Yeah.
a major there, and maybe there's enough there
Okay.
uh, to to include that as a goal. It depends on whether OP can bring out a biotech story in the career goals essay. Okay, so basically, John, a whole heap of points there that I want to
Yeah.
sink my teeth into.
Sure. Okay.
Let's start with the goals, right? We're on the topic of biotech here. So we know that the narrative of I've been in corporate banking, retail banking, any other area
Mhm.
of banking, and want to pivot into investment banking, we know that can work. We know that's a very tried and tested narrative. It's a very classic reason for going into for doing an MBA, particularly if OP targeted, for example, a MBA recruitment program of an established bank.
Mhm.
Up
Yep.
till there, I'm on board. The problem I've got here, and I've witnessed this firsthand with clients in the past, is that Vietnamese applicants, for whatever reason, can sometimes struggle to get the required work authorization
Mhm.
at banks, or generally in the US corporate space, but especially at banks. And I think that might be a little bit of a concern for
Mhm.
the business schools as well. If they can't place OP into the role that he wants, then obviously that's going to be a negative for him for his profile. So I would really strongly encourage OP to research which banks have, for example, sponsored Vietnamese people in the recent past. Maybe you can go on LinkedIn and do some stalking there and figure that out. There is definitely differences between the bulge bracket banks, which ones are more open to sponsoring internationals and have done more so in the past. And OP should show evidence of that research in the essays. List the banks, right? Name them in your career goals essay. Specifically call out the banks that you think have strong biotech, but also a history of sponsorship. So that's one thing. So be very, very careful on that. And if you feel that narrative, if you feel that sponsorship angle might be an issue, maybe for the sake of your narrative, say that you're going to go back to Vietnam as well. You obviously
Yep.
have work experience and permits and ability to work in Vietnam. Maybe that narrative is more palatable, or it could be a backup essay. I'm not sure if Fuqua, for example, was Duke Fuqua on this list? No, Duke have in their career goals essay. They say, "What's your alternative goal?" So
Mhm.
maybe your alternative goal could be to return to Vietnam. I know for sure that these banks are growing their Vietnamese presence. It is a rapidly expanding market. So maybe you could lead the investment banking expansion of
Mhm.
JP Morgan in Vietnam, for example. So just be careful to be specific and realistic about your goals. That's one point I wanted to mention. John, you got any comments on that?
No, I love that. I think it all makes sense. The caution makes sense, Sam. But I think, you know, visas aside, I think, the narrative of returning to one's home country or finding ways to embrace a unique geographical advantage and background and expertise is what will help the narrative, regardless of, this employment roadblock.
Okay, interesting. So the other questions then were around. A bit of lag on my screen there. Right, here we go. Um, do you think there's that much difference? OP seems to be laser focused on T15.
Mhm,
Do you think that if OP could get a T20 offer, for example,
mhm.
let's just for the sake of argument say that he gets a T20 offer, do you think that that T15 T20 split is big enough for OP to base his entire life plans around?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't it seems to be that OP is a little bit over focused on this label of T15.
Hmm. Hmm.
I understand that if that there is a certain threshold above which, below which it's not perhaps worth going to the US, it's not worth going through all the hurdles, it's not worth quitting a job. But it seems to me like if OP's goals are to pivot into investment banking, I had a client last year tell me that UNC Keenan Flagler put more people into banking than Duke did. They're obviously rival schools very close by.
Hmm.
Duke is
Hmm.
T15, Keenan Flagler is T20 or thereabouts. And so I would encourage OP, don't be too focused on this T15 label. Focus more on your goals and which schools can give you those goals. For example, in this list, Cornell Johnson is a classic feeder school for New York investment banking. They have a really strong pedigree and history. Okay, it's in Ithaca, it's a 4-hour bus ride or whatever out of New York, but they have that network in New York City.
Hmm.
Going to New York City for the end of the week or for the weekend for coffee chats, etc., is something that clients do, that applicants do, more so perhaps than MIT Sloan, for example, which has got a much more engineering pedigree. So I would encourage OP to narrow this school list down more on goals than on ranking as such. I think a lower ranked school with an investment banking pedigree is going to be more value add than a higher ranked school without the pedigree. Just my two
I
cents.
love that. No, Sam, that makes total sense. And one thing to just to build on that, the parent institution brand also matters, especially in internationally. So in Southeast Asia, in
Mhm.
Asia, the Cornell brand as an Ivy League institution will also go pretty far. And
Mhm.
so, I would obviously look at, the rankings for business schools and they, I mean, well, obviously we have different, you know, perspectives on how the rankings this year's went down, but also look at the prestige of the overall university. And, applying to T20 school and getting a scholarship there can always just help if you happen to get in a T15 school and you want to negotiate scholarships. So again, that's just additional things to help, reinforce this case.
Yeah, scholarship. Yeah, we haven't really mentioned this, but if you could get a T20 scholarship or a T15 without a scholarship, that would really strengthen
Uh-huh.
the case. Yeah, good, really good point. Okay, so this introverted point we've covered. We've said it's not that big a deal. Also, yeah, you're right. There's plenty of introverts on an MBA program. I don't know statistically, like from a psychology perspective, what percentage. I know that it's fair to say that MBAs do tend to lean towards more extroverted people, but that doesn't by no means mean that it's only introverted people. It doesn't only extroverts, but it also like during the essay process and the application process, there's no reason why that would even really come up. Like, okay, maybe you want to
Hmm.
focus a leadership story around like a particular leadership style that links to you being introverted. Maybe you want to tell for example, a leadership story of having a new joiner join the firm as maybe an intern that you were responsible for overseeing, and they were clearly introverted. But I'm also an introvert, so I help manage them and help them bring out their personality and have an impact on our team. There's a way that that can work for you if you
Hmm.
even want to bring it up. On the other hand, it could just, it just doesn't have to come up in the essays if you don't want it to, and it doesn't have to be a factor either. So I don't think the introversion is an issue at all. I think more to the point, this ability to work with Canadians and work with Americans, I think that might be something that could be brought up in the application and wouldn't do any harm. Obviously, somebody who's only lived and worked with Vietnamese people is going to be at a slight disadvantage to somebody who's had that international perspective. Is that fair?
Yep. No, way fair.
Totally aligned. Good. Okay, excellent. So I think we've covered everything that OP wanted to mention there. There's one other thing that I want to bring up here. This is me being a little bit sassy, so allow me because it's Friday. Gym. John, the number of people I work with, when I say, so what are your hobbies? What do you do in your spare time? Oh, I go to the gym. Bore off. Like everybody goes to the gym, really. Or like, not everybody, fine. But like loads of MBA applicants go to the gym. You're not going to stand out by making this a big thing in your application. Like really try and avoid it. Anybody who's an athlete who's applying to MBA programs, which is a substantial proportion every year, goes to the gym as well. And guess what? They do it seriously, right? They compete.
Hmm. Hmm.
Anybody who's military goes to the gym every day as well. And guess what?
Hmm.
They don't write about it.
Hmm.
So it's not really a factor in this profile, but anybody watching, like, for God's sake, don't make the gym a big part of your application unless you competed in like,
Yes. Yeah.
Olympic weightlifting
Yeah.
or like it was some really meaningful factor in like a resilience story and it helped me
Hmm.
rebuild after a,
Hmm.
a, a life issue that I'd been through. In that case,
Yeah.
maybe the gym is part of your story,
Sure.
but really the bar is pretty high. If you're going to mention gym, it needs to be meaningful for your application. John, you were reading applications. You're on the other side of this. Is that fair?
That's very fair. Look, I mean, I've worked with clients who have had meaningful forays with gym. Whether it's having participated in CrossFit competitions or near Olympic level weightlifters. The only essay where I can potentially see gym come alive is in the what makes you feel alive essay for Haas. And even then, you don't just want to say things like, Jim makes me feel alive
Testosterone makes me feel
because,
alive.
like, right. It's sort of like, is there a deeper story behind the gym? Is there a deeper connection to the gym? If you spend a third of your day in the gym, like, what has come out of it? Did you get, business context from it? I mean, look, if if you don't have any sort of competitive benchmarks to mention in this gym in his gym interest, find a different way to bring it out that is deeply creative. Otherwise, I'm with you, Sam. This is not the most this is not going to stand out.
I don't think it's a fact. OP, we're not having a go at you. Don't worry. It's we understand it's not core to your narrative. There's lots of other stuff there, but just generally, anybody watching, be a bit wary about overweighting the gym. Okay, excellent. Now, I think maybe one last point to mention on this. I just want to before we move on. You're saying OP says that OP scoring 330 on the example tests. And John, you mentioned in your overview that even if that comes in a little bit lower, it's still fairly strong. I want to just clarify that to anybody watching. As a general rule of thumb, the example tests, most people score a little bit higher in the example tests than in the actual test, specifically in their first test. Right. It's your first time in a new testing environment. The example tests are sometimes slightly different from the real tests. There's a whole heap of reasons for it. But basically, in your first test, don't kick yourself if you end up a little bit lower than what you've been scoring in your practice tests. It happens all the time. Take it as a data point, as a useful data point, and then move on and take the test again. Every time you take the test, you're likely to get a little bit closer to what you're scoring in your example tests. So in this case, right, we'll give OP the benefit of the doubt, but just nothing's final until that score is in the bag. And generally to other people watching, don't add too much weight to a high practice test score. Start raising your expectations in terms of which schools you should be applying to. Just be a little bit wary on that because most people score 3, 4, 5 points higher on the GRE in the practice test than they do in the real one. Okay, point made. Right, let's move on then. Let's move on to the next profile. John, now this is an interesting one. So this applicant is considering whether to reapply, has offers in the bag, and is still considering whether to reapply. So let's dig into it. Has received an offer from UNC Keenan-Flagler. No dollars yet, no scholarship yet, but hoping to maybe get some reconsideration, and was admitted to ESA in Barcelona with scholarship money. But OP is seriously considering waiting and reapplying next year because I was unemployed when I applied this year, which likely hurt my outcomes. Interesting. Indian male, based in the Middle East, GMAT 715, CFA level 1. Undergrad is from a top engineering school, but with a low GPA. We don't know how low, so we'll make some assumptions there and we'll talk about it. Work experience, 5 years, 3.5 at a boutique consulting and research firm, 1.5 years as head of product, and current role is a buy-side associate at a family office. So very sort of scattered and diverse work experience there. Nothing stellar on the extracurriculars. Bit of mentoring, bit of collegiate motorsports, as we've talked about before. Undergrad ECs don't carry quite as much weight. Goals: break into investment banking, M&A, transaction advisory, or McKinsey, Bain, BCG consulting. Long-term goal: working in a sovereign wealth fund in the Middle East. Dilemma: now that I'm doing well in my career, should I take the offers that I've got from ESA or UNC, or should I reapply, hope for an M7, given that I'm laser focused on IB/consulting to sovereign wealth fund in the Middle East? Whew. Lots of detail. Thank you, OP, for giving us all that detail. It's really, we've got everything that we need there. It's really nice request. John, let's start with the profile evaluation. How do you see this profile?
Yeah, a couple of things that give me pause about this profile. I think overall there are some bright spots in it. Starting with academics, I think a 715 Focus Edition is a strong score. I think applying with that and getting mixed outcomes, maybe the employment did play a more outsized factor in the rejection, but the academic profile is pretty strong overall. Now, I don't know what the GPA is. I don't know how low it must have been. It's probably a CGPA out of 10. But if there were some extenuating circumstances to help allay some of the concern, that would be worth mentioning. But I think that academically, I think about 3 to 3.5 out of 5, assuming that GPA was probably a pretty damning one. Professionally, buy-side exposure in the Middle East, entrepreneur experience building a tech venture, scaling that venture as well. I love the breadth. I would like to see more of a tie between the finance job as well as what OP did with the tech venture. So if there's more of a story behind it, great. From what I see now, it's probably a 3.5 to 4 out of 5, depending on how connected those experiences are. Demographic, Indian male, yes, that's an ORM, a little bit less ORM given OP's been working in the Middle East, but it's been fairly common to see a ton of them working in the Middle East and applying to these top business schools. Goals, returning to Middle East makes sense. Sovereign wealth fund makes sense. I don't know if MBB is the right path because MBBs do look at GPAs when they make their hiring decisions, although that FE would help a little bit. I just think success in some of these in getting some of these roles hinges on having built great relationships, and it sounds like having been in that region, OP probably has a few relationships in place, and so I think it's fairly standard. I don't have any concerns there. Overall, I do like the profile with a couple caveats that we can dive into.
Okay, brilliant. Can we start with this goals aspect? This rubbed me up the wrong way a little bit when I read it. I want to explain why. There's nothing in this profile that's screaming to me that MBB is the right route. There's no real consulting experience in the past. There's nothing in there that's saying like that makes sense. And then if it's the fact that it's MBB or IB, just makes me think OP is chasing money.
Yeah.
It's just like, I want to make money. And that is just, if that was the narrative that you used, OP, in your previous set of applications, that's what has handicapped you, right? If you've said as goals IB or MBB, there's nothing else in common. Like, not, it's very difficult to identify anything in common with those other than they make money. And so I think that that is probably been the key issue in your previous application. Am I being harsh, John?
Yeah, I'm scratching my head figuring out what the red flag, was in the profile. Because academically, look, I mean, I trust that OP has gone to a fairly top college. If it's not IIT, it's probably, BITS, which is Berla, or NIT, which is also a pretty top school. The work experience has a good breadth. I think something was lost in translation in the narrative, or if OP wasn't able to explain a couple things in his application well, and AdCom probably had a few doubts. That's probably why
Yeah.
what went down.
Yeah, I think it's that goal. I think that short-term goal sucks. Let's be more.
Mhm.
Let's talk about what it could be. Like, let's be more. Let's be a bit more specific in this. So obviously, yeah, make it. I want to go into a high-paying industry. Doesn't work.
Yeah.
I let's. What I would suggest is that this is quite a broad range of experience here, and so there is some element of breadth of experience, which is quite nice. I would, and the other thing that I really like, I think we're agreed that the long term goal of working in a sovereign wealth fund in the Middle East, if you can get it, that is a
Hmm.
nice long term goal. Slight
Hmm.
caveat to that is I was under the impression that they tend to hire locals.
Hmm.
My All of my sovereign wealth fund clients in the past in the Middle East have been, so PIF is the one that jumps to mind,
Sure.
have been locals. Are they going to hire somebody from abroad? Uh, Possibly, but check that makes sense. But
Sure.
assuming that it does work, assuming that the sovereign wealth fund idea works, then the logical stepping stone to that is investment banking, and
Hmm.
focus then this short-term goal on investment banking. And yeah, M&A and transaction would make sense there,
Hmm.
and just cut out MBB. Just drop that off, and that way you're building a hardcore finance narrative that that can work. That can work.
Yeah.
Are you aligned?
Um, I'm aligned. The one thing that I love to throw in there is when most people talk about going into investment banking, that's a pretty generic function that they talk about. And,
Yeah.
OP's background makes sense to make that transition. But I think most people just miss, focus in investment banking. I think OP has the opportunity to tie in his experience working, like sort of specking and evaluating enterprise SaaS firms. Maybe OP has discovered that enterprise SaaS is still nascent in the region, and he wants to steer, sovereign wealth strategy towards investing in that spaces. And he has empathy and experience having been in the trenches of scale companies like these. And I
Nice.
think this can be one way to sort of build a tighter narrative. And it
Mm,
can be one way to, really position him as, not just another finance dude.
yeah. Yeah, I like that as well. That's really, really nice. Let's target the specific questions being asked then. So, do you think, in conclusion, do you think he has a realistic shot at T10 M7?
T10, I'm cautiously optimistic. M7, I just had to know more about that GPA, and
Mhm.
but should he not apply to the M7? I think it's worth applying to one or two. Um, but I think with a bang up essay and a stronger narrative, I think he may have a shot there.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I suspect that OP applied to some T15s, sorry, to some M7s in his last round. So I think he also perhaps kind of knows his own answer to this, right? If he's applied to UNC and he's applied to ESA, I'm sure he applied to a couple of T15,
Mhm.
couple of
Mhm.
couple of M7s, T10s in his application and got dinged.
Yep.
So I think for me, the key question is what changes? What changes? Because GPA is not going to change. GMAT was probably already there. What changes? I think the only thing that can really change is the narrative, the goals,
Mhm.
the
Yep.
focus on a particular area of
Hmm.
investment banking. In our previous roast, we just talked about the Vietnamese guy focusing on the biotech space.
Hmm.
I'd like something similar here if possible. And maybe that, as you say, that's something like focusing on the tech space based on his head of product role. Not
Hmm.
sure, but I think the conclusion there is yes, M7 T10 cautiously positive, but that's going to need a very strong narrative and goal.
Yep.
Yeah, cool. Okay, excellent. Good. Well, let's move on to the next. Actually, one last thing. Do you think this unemployed question? This is something that OP is clearly worried about. Do you think that
Mhm.
the fact that he was unemployed when he applied had a negative effect, and do you think that's going to turn around largely, given that he's now got a job?
I think it would help. I don't think the unemployment was probably the major factor in why he was dinged from some of those, higher ranked schools that he applied to. And the
Mm,
reality is that a lot of people applying to, recently there's been an influx of people applying from a position of unemployment. And so, those that are able to emerge from it with unemployment not being a concern tend to be explain what they've been doing, during their time out of work, and ways they've been upskilling themselves, whether it's volunteering or learning a new skill, things like that. I
mm.
think adcoms cut folks a fair amount of slack, if you're able to just reasonably explain what went on. I suspect that OP probably didn't devote too much context around there, and just going back to what you had suggested, Sam, about the narrative. I think that's probably played a role too.
Yeah, right. So let's be explicit. If OP is going to explain that. Now, obviously, if he reapplies, he's now got a
Mhm.
job. It's not a factor. But anybody watching this who's unemployed and thinking about MBA applications, two ways to really hammer home, yeah, make that not an issue. One, optional essay. Nearly all schools give you a 250, 500 word optional essay. And it literally says in the prompt, any extenuating circumstances, anything else we should be aware of. If you're unemployed and your resume shows you are unemployed, write about it in your optional essay. Write about why it happened. Write about what you learned during the time. Write about how you've developed. Write about how you've used the time. And it doesn't have to torpedo your application if handled well. The other thing I would highlight is recommenders. If you have a recommender from your last role, which is the natural recommender to have, make sure that they include in their LOR some context around that redundancy, right? Was your entire department shut down? Did the business get closed? Like what happened? And as long as it's not like, you were inappropriate in the workplace and you got fired, then it probably isn't going to be a
Mhm.
big negative for you. And if it's coming from your recommenders, there's some credibility there. Have I missed anything, John? Those two
Yep.
places?
Yep. Makes sense to me.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, let's move on to final profile number 4. John, we have a veteran. Always 5-10% of the cohort are veterans, so it's a nice profile to talk about. So, what can I do to boost my profile? So, for context here, a lot of veterans are moving from the military into the business world, as they call it, and there's always questions around how to make that transition effectively. There are lots of programs like the Yellow Ribbon program, which is mentioned here, that help military applicants get into the workplace and get into top MBA programs. So there is always quite a lot of military applicants in any one given year. So let's talk about the background. Working on the GRE, fine. Big Four audit, CPA in my top 5 largest US city. Okay. US Marine, 5 years, no combat deployments. Did manage a group of 7 subordinates, selected for an infantry leadership course. 320 GRE as it stands, 3.9 GPA. 4.0 in major courses. John, I'd like to talk to you about the difference between those and how schools look at that. Bachelor's in accounting, no masters. Leadership, volunteering experience, local animal shelter photography. It's quite random, quite nice. Habitats for Humanity build projects. Okay. LORs from an audit engagement partner and former Marine commanding officer. Sufficient GI Bill to cover tuition for 2 years is what I was referring to before. Career goal. Fortune 500 strategy is what OP is aiming for. Would like to work in strategy consulting for a few years beforehand. Is my GRE the only thing I can work on at this point? Appreciate any honest advice. Okay, so in the world of military applicants, John, how do you see this profile?
I like this profile overall. Look, a 3.9 is a strong GPA. Even though it's not from a super competitive school. At 320 now, probably not the best combination. I pegged this, the academic section of 3 out of 5, but I'm an optimistic person, Sam, and I'm sure OP will get that GRE score up. Professionally, I've worked with a fair number of senior auditors at Big Four companies. I think it's great that OP has this technical experience. Even better if he's able to show some management leadership experience, some experience having done M&A evaluation, things like that. I think based on what I see so far, this is the professional experience is strong, especially if you're able to couple in the military experience and all the leadership, great leadership stories that are associated with it. So from what I see now, probably a 3.5, potentially a 4 out of 5 in the professional bucket. And then demographic, beyond being a veteran, there's not much to opine on here. Goal, strategy, consulting, I think this would be a good opportunity to talk about, focus on some, government military focused areas. And we can talk a little bit about ways that OP can sharpen this, later, Sam. But, I think, if you're competing against other MBB hopefuls, this can potentially be an uphill battle, especially if the GRE is not at that competitive level. So for now, I'll give it a 3.5 out of 5. Overall, average plus, potentially solid profile if there is more to if there's a strong narrative in place.
Definitely lots to talk about. Let's focus first. I've got this question around the GPA. How should, in this case, there's not that much difference between the overall GPA of 3.9 and the major GPA of 4.0. I've seen, and we've roasted clients in the past, applicants in the past, who've got a bigger difference there. Can you talk to us from the position of the admissions committee? How are they seeing a difference between an overall GPA and a major GPA? What is considered big? Talk to us about that.
Yeah. For the most part, the important number is always the regular GPA, but some schools look at major GPA just to see, okay, is your high GPA being buoyed by a number of classes, like classes that are not as challenging, that have propped up your GPA? If, let's say, your major GPA is much lower than your overall GPA, that can be a cause for concern. If your major GPA is higher than your regular GPA, and it's because you were taking more challenging courses outside your comfort zone where you got lower grades, that can also be a plus too. There are so many scenarios that can come out of the discrepancies between GPA and major GPA. But the beauty of what we're seeing here, Sam, is that OP's GPA and major GPA are pretty similar to each other, and its major GPA is even higher. And so I think net that is a positive to have a major GPA, especially in a major that is a target major, a more rigorous one. That's always a plus. So I think if you're able to spin a good story out of having a higher major GPA than a regular GPA, that's always a positive thing.
Good. I love it. Let's talk about goals. I have mixed feelings on this. As I've talked about, several times in previous roasts and even today, strategy consulting as a goal is not, a lot of people default to it, but it's not right for everybody. I'm sort of on the fence in this case. I think that for the sake of creating a strong narrative, for the sake of creating a story that's like laser focused on a real cause that OP cares about or is particularly strong in, consulting isn't great for that. Consulting,
Hmm.
generally, you'd be a generalist as a management consultant at an MBB. You'd typically be a generalist after the MBA, and you lose the ability to laser focus on a particular part of your narrative. You can compensate for that by focusing on it longer term, but it's not as nice. I would encourage OP to at least consider this idea of, okay, which Fortune 500 company strategy role is good, but which Fortune 500 would give you a chance to write a really cool story? I'm just imagining, for
Hmm.
example, John, a defense company, right? Like off the top of my head, Lockheed Martin is the one that jumps to
Hmm.
mind, for example, right?
Yep.
Lockheed Martin, a classic military recruiter. Is there a strategy role at Lockheed that makes sense that you can build a nice story around?
Yep.
Maybe. Maybe. And if that's the case, I would say that's probably a stronger narrative than
Hmm.
the MBB consulting narrative, just because it's more focused, it's more specific.
Yep.
Obviously, when you're on the MBA program, OP, if you decide to recruit for consulting and give it a shot, yeah, go for it. Your narrative is not necessarily what you actually really end up doing. Bit of being a bit strategic here, but I do think something like a Lockheed would make sense. John, am I missing something?
A couple things, Sam. I often think as narrative as more closely tying into a long-term goal. And
Okay.
I think what you mentioned about Lockheed Martin and being joining a defense company, given OP's military background, makes total sense. My only concern is that OP's background is not in strategy. And so if you're going from consulting strategy to in-house strategy, that makes sense. But OP has audit experience, and typically it's easier to go from audit at a strategy big four or an MBB. Oh, sorry, it's easier to go from strategy from audit at a big four to strategy consulting at a big four, which is a transition that I've seen happen very successfully, including those for my own clients. Which is why I've sort of looked at it like, if OP wants I think consulting could be a good interim short-term goal, especially if OP can add a little bit more nuance to it. So I'm thinking, consulting firms, not just, like a big four firm, but also one that has traditionally done work in the government or defense sector. Booz Allen Hamilton comes to mind, and I'm sure there are a couple others, more specialized firms that OP can mention. Then
Mm.
using what he's learned at these companies to position himself better at a company like Lockheed Martin. There may be other paths to pursue as a short-term goal, but I can see a bull case for why consulting could work, provided that it has a little bit more focus and isn't just a generic MBB goal that many applicants write in their application essays.
Yeah. I like that. So to summarize, what we're saying is regarding goals, you've got two choices. One of them is focus on the audit narrative and maybe an interesting engagement with a pivot to management consulting, or tell the military story, use a military story and pivot to Lockheed, right? That, to me, those are the two logical goals, logical
Hmm.
narratives that come out of this profile.
Hmm. Yep.
Okay, let's talk about the GRE, right? Currently, OP is scoring a 320, but acknowledges it's not quite high enough yet and is retesting. Let's say OP is going to focus on an M7. Where do you
Yep.
think that GRE needs to be?
I think the GPA will give a little bit of a impressive buffer. So I think even then mid 320s is a comfortable range. I would say 325 plus or minus one would probably be that range that OP should aim for.
Good. Yeah, I'm aligned. I think that makes a lot of sense. Uh, let's talk about these letters of recommendation. So I think this is a perfect set of LORs, right?
Hmm.
Current role, previous role, basically. Manager, current role, manager, previous role. It's dreamy, right?
Yeah, that's great. You get, someone endorsing you for your audit chops, your analytical ability, and you have someone endorsing your leadership experience. I think it's a perfect combination.
I love that. And so for anybody watching, kind of translating this to other profiles, as a good rule of thumb, your current manager from your current role and your previous manager from your previous role is generally a good place to start with your letters of rec. Now, there might be reasons why you can't do that, but good place to start. And that's exactly what OP is doing here. Okay, fantastic. Last point that I would like to highlight, it's worth noting that one of our consultants in our team, Zach Hoyt, is a military veteran who used the MBA to pivot into management consulting at McKinsey. He's basically done one of these narratives, one of these ideas that you had, he's already done. He did that via Harvard. OP, if you're watching this and you'd like to speak to a military veteran with an MBA admissions consulting experience, Zach Hoyt is a really, really good place to start. You can meet him via the website. You go to samweeks.com. Top right-hand corner, there's a button to book calls with the consultants. You can meet me, you can meet John, or you can meet Zach. And I think for military applicants, that would make a lot of sense. Okay, John, we are all out of profiles for today. Thank you very, very much for your time. Really, really nice to catch up. And I will see you next week to roast a few more profiles.
Roast you next week, Sam.
Roast you next week. Anybody watching who'd like to speak to me or John, go to samweeks.com, book a chat. Make sure you upload your resume or share your LinkedIn profile so we have plenty of juicy background about you. And we can talk about your profile, which schools, how to build a narrative, constructive feedback on your resume. Get quite a lot out of a 20-minute chit chat. See you next week.